back, everyone, to Faith Infused Leadership. I'm your co-host, Meredith Banka, and I am here with Debbie Heiser. She is the host of Faith Infused Leadership and also the founder of Three Vines Consulting. How are you doing, Debbie?
I am doing fantastic. Thank you. After a great weekend. What about yourself?
Yeah, really, really good. And I'm excited about today's topic. So we're talking about courage in leadership and what that looks like. So what brought this topic to the forefront of your mind?
I think for me, Meredith, it came to mind because I deal with this with most of my clients in some way, shape or another, meaning that either from a personal perspective or from a leadership where they have employees and being courageous, or whether it's stepping out in courage and doing something in your business that you've been wanting to do, but you're afraid of it. And so for me, courageous leadership hits multiple different areas that I'm sure you'll ask me about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the first that I think of is courage under fire. You think about that so often, and with, economic kind of ups and downs that all of us have seen happening for the last 10 years or so, that puts leaders in a pretty, interesting position in the case of maybe layoffs or and shifts and changes that are happening, and how they need to use courage in communication with their teams.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. I'll share a story. I'm not going to share the company I was with just for privacy reasons, but I was with a company where traditionally any kind of layoffs would happen. And they typically happened in fourth quarter, as the year-end budget was happening. And we did some movement a lot of times between different locations in the US. And so I felt it coming. I knew it was coming, but I knew it was a ways out. And part of why I knew that is I was part of an executive group at that particular site. So I was privy to some conversations as well. And that corporation was very complex, a lot of layers. And I stood up and I said, look, I know something's coming and I'd much rather be proactive about this. And we don't have to come right out and say, yes, this is going to happen here. But I found in my experience that if you talk to people and allow them enough time to do something, to help themselves from a Maslow's hierarchy perspective, then typically they're pretty loyal. And so as an example, we were moving numerous people to work out of their homes. The fear was, as if we talked to this group of people that were trainers, that they wouldn't go out and continue to train these people, and we would be short on trainers because they'd all leave and go find other jobs. When in fact, the opposite happened. So by being able to talk about it and saying, this looks like it's going to be a 9 to 12 month process. And as we go forward, let's help people find jobs. But the team came together and they decided who were going to be the last two men standing. Like they said, this person and this person are going to be the last two. We're going to, they've committed to that. We're going to try to find jobs for people. Everybody was looking for other people within the company as well as out. And it just became this really nice, rich dialogue that happened with the group. And they were so committed to helping that project be successful versus the opposite of going from fear. Right. But and I'm not touting my own horn, but it took me, the courage to stand up and say, I know this is going to happen. So let's talk about it.
Right. Right. And I think that's obviously courageous, being willing to step forward and say, hey, there's an elephant in the room and we need to talk about this. But there are other areas where I think people express courage in leadership too. And we were talking about that before we started today. So where else do you see leaders having the opportunity to be courageous?
Yeah, I love that. Looking at opportunities to be courageous. I think the number one area that leaders have that opportunity is when it comes to dealing with customers and dealing with employees. And as an example, if a customer is dissatisfied with a service, how many times does a business not even reach out to them and find out why? It's more of, we need to take the defense mode, whether it's on social media or Yelp, or if it's just in person, it becomes more defensive versus, you know what, Meredith, if you're my client, I want to know the feedback so that I don't continue to emulate that with other people if it's a trend, or there are times that there's just somebody that has an anomaly that brings something up, but it's really more about gathering that feedback from people and understanding what's going on. So having the courage to call that client, call that customer and say, hey, I'm sorry you had a bad experience. Tell me about it. Like what would have worked better for you? I want, in the spirit of innovation and making things better for people, I want to do that. It goes back to something we talked about in one of the first couple of episodes about intention and the waiter and waitress story. You know, if the client knows that my intention is to get better, even if there's some disparity, usually they'll give me some feedback.
Yeah.
The other piece is
I was going to say on that real quickly, what you're making me recognize, what you're helping me to see, is that there's a component of curiosity versus defensiveness that plays right into this opportunity to be courageous. So if we can face that disgruntled customer with curiosity after they blast some, you know, not so awesome social media comment on our business Facebook page or our Yelp or whatever, if we can approach that with curiosity instead of taking it personally and getting defensive, that just opens the door to so much more conversation, so much more value.
Absolutely. And Meredith, I look back on, you know, as we talk about faith, I look back on Christ and some of his model, and, you know, anger is not a bad thing. And he had anger too. But when you think back to the times that he was confronted with different things and had conflict, and it wasn't necessarily clients, but, you know, the one time where they wanted to stone the prostitute, he's in the sand drawing stuff and everybody's looking at him like, what's going on? And in my mind, I think that's where he took the big pause, right? He took time, he's praying, he's thinking, he's like taking his time to think about his response versus that emotional response. So some of this also has to do with emotional intelligence. And being self-aware enough and being confident enough in yourself and what you stand for and your values to understand that you can approach someone humbly and with that mindset of curiosity. And it's not personal. And usually if someone does lambast you, it's a mirror and they're looking at something that's bothering them. And it will say a lot more about their character actually than it will yours. And so I always look at it and say, how can I take the high road and how can I learn from this experience? And sometimes they're not willing to give you feedback, but you might as well try.
Sure. Well, and I think that's also where you're showing courage by stepping into the situation and knowing that you might not get the outcome that you were hoping for, right? That disgruntled person, that disgruntled customer might just lay into you with all sorts of language and all sorts of emotion and anger. But don't you see that the flip side of that is doesn't take the conversation anywhere. It doesn't improve anything by not at least offering the opportunity, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of times what ends up happening is the person is so shocked that you called to get the feedback that they'll typically try your service or your product again.
Yeah.
Because it builds a little bit of loyalty and they know that you care about them as people and not just as a client or a customer. And kind of that same thing holds true with employees. So it goes back to that intention. And if my intention is to help you, and I have this firm belief that inherently everybody comes to work wanting to do a good job. They don't come to work to screw things up or do things incorrectly. And so when I look at each person that way and say, this person is here and they want to do a good job, they just may not have the skill set for it. And or I go back to situational leadership, which we will get to in one of these episodes, that they may not understand the value of doing something the way we've asked them to do it. And so you do have to go through a series of, you know, understanding that employee and where they're at. But sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is help them uncover what their passions are. And truly that's part of what I do is I spark people's passions to ignite their businesses and look at all of those infinite possibilities. And so if I'm in the pool, I'm going to use a lane pool here as an example. And if I'm in the pool and I'm going back and forth in between lanes, I'm not doing anything well. And until I find what my gifts are and I find what my talents are, believer or not believer, as a leader, I hold that as a responsibility of mine, is helping people understand where their passions are, where their gifts are, so that they can swim in their lane. And they can do a really nice job of doing what they do. And it's interesting because there's something about this Western culture with our work that we kind of define ourselves by our work. And so when we can find our lane and we feel like we're accomplishing and doing well in our work, everything else kind of falls into play. We're happier people. And so, and it doesn't feel like work.
Right.
And so sometimes the most courageous leaders, or I would say the courageous leaders, stand up and ask the right questions of their employees to find out. It's almost like you're being a life coach to find out what is it that they love to do? What do they love about this job? And frankly, that starts in the hiring process. I always ask that. When they walk through their resume, I said, what did you love about that job? And what didn't you like so well about that job? Because it helps you with an environmental fit. So when you get to that point where you're coaching someone, hopefully, you know, and I've had this experience where literally most of the time when I had to fire someone or even lay them off, it was about more so them even self-selecting that potentially they weren't in their lane and helping them find other jobs. And some of my biggest success stories actually as a leader were helping people find another job either within the same company or outside the company that they then loved what they did. Because that's an energy filler versus an energy vampire.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes people are so clearly close to their own situation, close to, it's almost like there's some blinders that are on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as that courageous manager or leader, by having this willingness to share your perceptions and your viewpoint with them, I mean, I'm sure you've seen that kind of aha moment of the employee where they're like, wow, I didn't even recognize that this was going on. Yeah. And so allowing people to see that is just huge, right? And so empowering for everyone that's involved. So when you were talking a little bit earlier about curiosity and in the hiring process, how do you help managers learn how to use curiosity from the beginning in the hiring process all the way through to the review process, maybe the termination process, the promotion process? How do we encourage managers to get better at this?
Yeah, Meredith, I'm going to use actually an interesting story with a nonprofit that I've been involved in before, where this even works when you're trying to find volunteer board members, non-paid positions, but it's similar to an employee. And what I found is 9 times out of 10, until someone goes through some training on how to actually interview well, they tend to be the one doing all the talking. Well, this person's applying for that position, or they want to be a part of that board. You don't have to oversell the board. Find out from them what their skills are, what they would bring to the board. And so what I immediately tell people is when you're interviewing someone, the interviewee should be talking 70 to 80% of the time. Because we should be asking questions, learning about them, and really going through that discovery process to help understand not only would they be a good fit for the business, but would the business be a good fit for them? Because ultimately, and I don't know how many people really look at it this way, but if I'm interviewing for a job, I'm not interviewing just for that job. I want to see if the business is a good fit for me. And if it's not, and the company or the organization is not a good fit for me, the job is not going to be a good fit for me. And so it's really then too, on the opposite end of that is the interviewee. It's about having the courage to then also ask the important questions about culture, about, you know, processes or how things are done, so that you know that that fits in with your integrity and with your lane and what you feel strongly about. So
this has got to be also at the core related, perhaps, to the level of job dissatisfaction that we see. Right?
Yeah, I would say that's a big piece of it. The other piece of it, honestly, is a lot of the research points to money is not really why people leave jobs. People leave jobs because of their managers. And sometimes that is also equated with leaders that don't have the courage to work with those people that aren't fit for the job and allow them to stay. You actually lose your better people because they're sick and tired of covering for the other person, or that other person is just getting by.
Right. It's like the lowest common denominator philosophy, right?
Absolutely.
Your high performers aren't going to want to stay around for that.
Absolutely. And I think too, Meredith, one of the things, and I heard this actually, I don't remember where, but I loved the saying of it. But I've always talked about this theory that when you're hiring people, you should not be afraid. You should have the courage to hire someone that's better than you. Mm-hmm. And smarter than you, because what ends up happening is, honestly, as a leader, I feel like part of my job, particularly when I was in corporate America, was to groom someone to be able to take my job. Because then if someone asked me to apply for a promotion or, seek out a different job and be promoted, shame on me if I didn't have somebody to take my spot.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that's a whole nother subject matter that we could get into, right? Which would be really great for a future episode around, how do we create that kind of environment? Because that's when the fear piece starts creeping in, right? Definitely. So any other thoughts and ideas on where you see curiosity really expressed for leaders, and maybe how you've seen that turn the situation around that wasn't going the right way?
Yeah, Meredith. So when I think about curiosity, so I want to talk a little bit on being a courageous leader in the fact that part of certain applicable places like interviewing, like developing people, coaching them, that definitely needs to have curiosity, and you need to ask questions of people, and open-ended questions so that they can expound. One of my favorite things is to say, tell me more, or, will you please tell me a little more about that? Because it opens it up to get them to talking to you about those certain things. And that level of curiosity then helps you understand what makes your people tick, so that then you can also help influence in the way that speaks to them. Mm-hmm. Because your influence is a big key piece of servant leadership. And if you can't influence to what they care about, so putting the messages together for the employees based on what they care about, not what you care about. Same thing with customers. The message has to be about what your customers care about, not what you care about. There can be a blending of that. But that curiosity is really the only way that when you approach it, that it, to me, doesn't come off as egotistical or arrogant. When you're showing some leadership courage. Now, I will tell you, there are different times and places for different applications of that courage. If earlier you asked about, if you're under fire with things, if there are some fast moving things, people a lot of times, and frankly, you don't have the time to collaborate. Mm-hmm. So it's when you are collaborative in the times that it needs to be collaborative, your people then trust that you're going to make the right decisions based on the fact that you know them. You understand what makes them tick. And there are times, I use the military as an example. A lot of times they train rote over and over again. If you're in this situation, here's what you do. Same thing with astronauts. If you're in this situation, here's what you do, so that you have some muscle memory. You have some of those, like rote kind of things that happen. I joke that when I drive to work, it's kind of like sometimes I get to work and I don't remember driving to work. It's that routine of being there. And there are definitely times when you're under fire that you just need a leader to tell you what to do and you go do it. Mm-hmm. And that also takes courage. And as a leader, you have to be able to distinguish those times at the right time. Doesn't mean you're going to mess up, and there will be times you give direction when you shouldn't have, or vice versa. But that takes courage too, to be able to do that. A lot of times what I see, particularly with new managers, is they want to be liked. Mm-hmm. And the higher you go up in an organization, the lonelier it gets. Mm-hmm. And I might have said this before, but which is why I suggest getting a board of directors, getting some people you can talk through things with, because as you become a manager, it's not about getting all the employees to like you. Now, granted, if you're leading them, most of the people are going to respect you and like you, because the number one reason people leave is because they're managers, and they don't like their managers or respect their managers. And I will say, honestly, out of the hundreds of people that I've managed or led over the last 20 some odd years, I can think of maybe one or two that would not work for me again. Now, I don't know, when this goes out on Facebook, some of those people are on my Facebook. Feel free to comment and tell me wrong, or vice versa, or if you're right, but we all learn from different leaders, but it takes courage to love people. Mm-hmm. And that's part of, I guess, the message that I'm trying to say with that.
That's amazing. Well, if you want to know any more about the work that Debbie does, if you want to know any more about faith-infused leadership and the consulting that she works with, where would someone go to find that information?
Yeah, Meredith, I'm going to tell you that in just a second, but I want to leave with one quick applicable thing that people could start doing today, because
Awesome.
it also takes courage when you see someone, or you're in a networking event, or you're somewhere and you see that they have spinach in their teeth or pepper in their teeth. Don't let them walk around all day with pepper in their teeth. Tell them. But I can't tell you how many times I've had situations like that where I've been the first one to tell them, and they've seen or talked to a dozen other people. So that's just a quick applicable way that you can practice that muscle, and get that muscle into shape. And so to answer your question, if you would like some more information about this, feel free to go out to my website at www.3vconsulting.com and sign up for a free discovery session with me. I'd love to talk to you some more about being a courageous leader.
Fantastic. Well, I'm Meredith Banker, your co-host, and this is Debbie Heiser, your host of Faith Infused Leadership, and we're looking forward to seeing you the next time. Take care.